There's been lots of recorded research on utilizing gypsum in all parts of the world as a calcium and sulfur source for your soil and for your crop. Where I became interested in it is because of the fact that I have acidic soils here where I farm.
Knowledge for Resilience, a cross-commodity podcast brought to you jointly by the Peace River Forage Association, the Peace Region Forage Seed Association, the BC Grain Producers Association, and the Northern Cohort. Welcome to episode 22. I'm your host, Nadia Mori. Today I get to chat with not one, but two folks from Diverge Business Development on the scoop of gypsum. Mark Wilson and Brett Jans will share why it might be a good choice for soil health, when and how best to use it, and where you can get it right here in British Columbia. Gypsum is certainly not a new nutrient in town, but maybe one that hasn't gotten as much fanfare as it might deserve. If you are struggling with acidic soils, which are very common in the Peace region, gypsum might be a way to get sulfur and calcium into your soils without aggravating your pH problem. But let me hand it over to the experts, Mark and Brett with DBD. Without further ado, let's get a scoop of it. Today, I'm excited to talk to not just one, but two guests. I have Mark Wilson, Business Development Manager with DBD, and Brett Jans, agronomist with DBD. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello. Thank you very much for having us.
First off, I would love to, and I think our listeners would love to get to know you a bit better and how you got started with DBD.
Yeah, so my name's Mark. I come from a cement background, and I'm more of an operations person. But back in 2016, I crossed over into more of the agricultural industry, where I helped William, my business partner, get into the gypsum business. And as of 2021, I became a partner at Diverge Business Development, and now I'm helping grow the business here out of Kamloops, British Columbia.
Excellent. How about you, Brett?
Hi there. Mark neglected to mention, I'm pretty sure you're what are you, a chemical engineer or mechanical or...
Yes, I did go to school for chemical engineering, but as of now, I don't do any of the engineering side. It's more of building machines and then working on actually helping farmers, which is a big change for me.
So my name's Brett Jans. I have a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture from University of Saskatchewan, and I previously worked as an agronomist for an independent retail. And I moved up to the lead agronomist position, where I started working with farmers to try to manage soil pH and high sodium soils. And we come across gypsum as a great option for acidic soils to apply a sulfur source that was not going to have any detrimental effect on those low pH soils. And in that time frame, when I was trying to find gypsum products that were easily accessible to apply in central Alberta, I met William Neville, who is the guy who started Diverge Business Development. And we started working with his gypsum product. And then fortunately, I actually had the opportunity to go full-time farming. And so I'm now full-time farming. But William approached me and asked if I wanted to be an agronomist to help farmers use this gypsum and be able to answer some of those technical agronomy terms that William wanted somebody right here in Alberta who could deal directly with the farmers. So I was fortunate enough to join up with those guys.
Which kind of leads us to the cool story of how DBD got started. Who would like to lead us into that?
I'll take that one there. So it all started, William, my business partner, and I worked together at a cement manufacturing facility. And back in 2016, that facility closed. So the company decided to close the facility we were working at. So basically we lost our jobs at that point. But we were tasked with taking the assets of the facility and seeing if we could create other business streams. So William got started with that and created a business where we supplied gypsum, which is a natural additive in cement, and repurposed it to an additive in mushroom compost. And that's kind of where we started in 2016. So currently, we supply most of the mushroom farms in BC with their gypsum for their compost, which is where it kind of very things started. After that, William found out that gypsum has been being used in agriculture for a very long time. I think it's somewhere like 200 years. So it's kind of been forgotten about. But he started to work on that, and here we are today. It's probably the bigger part of our business, and it's where we see a lot of growth. And we've built and designed and now producing granular gypsum from a plant here we built in Kamloops. That's kind of where we're at today. So we're now looking to grow that business, hopefully, Western Canada wide at this point.
It's kind of like the phoenix out of the ashes. One company ended and you saw a great need and an opportunity and ran with it.
Yeah, no, it's been a lot of fun, a lot of learning. We have a lot of things to get better at, a lot of growing to do. But William's very good at finding opportunities and creating them and growing them.
So you mentioned gypsum has been used in agriculture for a long time. Do you want to just expand, or I guess maybe I'll throw that to Brett, to expand on the benefits of using gypsum on agricultural land and why it might be a good idea to go back on some of these old practices?
Yeah, you bet. So I'd have to do some more research into the actual dates as when people started using gypsum as a form of soil fertility, but it's definitely more than 100 years. There's been lots of recorded research on utilizing gypsum in all parts of the world as a calcium and sulfur source for your soil and for your crop. Where I became interested in it is because of the fact that I have acidic soils here where I farm. I've got an average pH of about 5. So definitely I'm, a full 1.5 lower than what I would like to be. And so when I was getting ammonium sulfate broadcast in front of our canola acres as a sulfur source, I thought that there's got to be a better option for something that is not making my acidic situation worse. Not that ammonium sulfate has a huge impact on affecting your soil pH, but over time, that ammonium sulfate is not going to benefit my acidic soil situation that I have. So then I learned about gypsum. And originally I learned about gypsum in university, but just never did think of it being a good source of sulfur for our crops on our farm until the opportunity came along to start working with some granular gypsum. And now the reason that I think it's a good fit for our farm is because we have low calcium soils and we have acidic soils. And so gypsum having calcium and being neutral, not having an impact on your soil pH, is not only supplying me with sulfur for my canola crop, but it's also supplying my soils with calcium, and it's not having any detrimental effect on my acidic soil. It's not making it worse. So that's why I think gypsum was such a good fit for our farm when we started using it about 5 years ago now.
Very cool. Now, if I haven't seen gypsum, what can you describe what it would look like and what maybe the products look like that you're producing?
I'll just cut in here. Everybody has seen gypsum because it's the same ingredients that's in drywall and in cement. But Mark,
very cool.
Mark can go into more of the details on the specs behind the product.
So the gypsum we use is actually a mineralized gypsum. So it actually comes right out of the ground or the side of a mountain. So we're mining it right here in Kamloops, and it's also mined in Invermere. It's drilled and blasted right out of the ground. So if you really wanted to imagine what gypsum is, it's just rock in the side of a hill until it's processed further. So you could just imagine it as a white, gray, sometimes pink, sometimes a browny gray colored rock. And it turns out after we pulverize it and grind it down, it turns into basically a really fine flour. And then we take that flour product, which is actually what's used in mushroom composting, and then we roll it into the small granules, which is a 2 to 5 mil granule that's the same as any other fertilizer style product that you spread on your grass or fields.
Brett, you alluded to how you found some usage for gypsum on your land to solve some of the issues. Do you want to expand on how it would be different from, say, if I apply lime to change my pH?
You bet. So lime is calcium carbonate, and I am not a chemist and I do not remember stoichiometry, but from what I understand, the calcium carbonate is going to react with the hydrogen ions in your soil to produce a hydroxide ion. Now that's just obviously anybody knows anything more about chemistry can correct me on that, but you need that carbonate component of lime to actually have an effect on your hydrogen ions in your soil to adjust your pH. Gypsum is just calcium sulfate.
Some of the producers here in the Peace region have applied some lime, and the one complaint that I kept hearing was how challenging it was to apply because it is quite dusty and powdery. And I'm sure you're struggling with the same in gypsum and are working towards resolving those issues.
Yes. So the other thing is the application rate. When you want to adjust your soil pH with lime, you have to think about the huge amount of pounds per acre that you need to be applying to make a significant change in your soil pH. For example, the rough math is if you've got a high organic matter soil with a cation exchange capacity of about 20, so you're in that clay loam range, to adjust your soil pH from a 5 to a 5.1 is going to take approximately 1,000 pounds per acre of lime. So if you want to move from a 5 to a 6, you need a minimum of 10,000 pounds an acre of lime to make that change, which I personally think you should never try to do that in 1 year, because you could do more damage than benefit by just shocking your soil that much. However, with gypsum, because I'm just using it as a sulfur source and calcium source for my canola, I'm only applying 200 pounds per acre, because that gets me approximately 34 pounds of sulfur and 42 pounds of calcium actual nutrients per acre. So the application rate is significantly different on what I'm trying to achieve with gypsum. I'm not trying to amend the soil. I'm just trying to provide my crop with calcium and sulfur. And when it comes to the difficulties of application, I'm using a granular product. So an air boom floater, like a rogator or a spin spreader, either one of those can apply that granular product very easily.
So your product is only sold as a granular then?
Yeah, the most popular product is the granular product, just due to the ease of handling and how it spreads so nicely. We do have one other product, which is a broadcast grade gypsum, which can only be spitter spread. It does cost, it's a little bit more cost effective, but it's just a little more difficult to handle. But if you're looking to spinner spread or broadcast in the fall and get a good swath of material over top of your fields, it's a good option for people. We're hoping next year to be able to have a product that can go in the seed row. So we'll go in the seed cart and go in the seed row. We currently can't do that with our product due to some of the dust residual on the outside of the granules. So that's one of the future keys to our business, is to have a nice coated product with no dust on the outside.
So definitely various options for application, and sounds like pretty straightforward ways of overcoming the issue of just having a pure powder product that would fly all over the field.
For sure, yeah. You definitely get a little bit of dust with the broadcast grade, but it's similar to spreading a lime product. You're going to get a little bit of that dust in the air from it. The granular is a little bit better, especially when using a boom floater.
So from an economic standpoint, why would somebody opt to use gypsum versus some other product? So we already talked about the pH benefit, that you're not making things worse by using a gypsum application. What would be some other, things that would show in your pocketbook?
Usually, in the past, gypsum and ammonium sulfate have been very competitive on their price per acre, on your actual pounds per acre of sulfur cost. This past year, when fertilizer went through the roof, gypsum stayed the same price. The only things that are causing the gypsum cost to go up in the long term is the cost that it takes to manufacture the product. So increase in labor cost, increase in transportation cost, and increase in natural gas prices. Whereas a product like ammonium sulfate, it's just going to continue to follow the nitrogen market. So there's a nice separation there from what the fertilizer markets are doing to manage your cost per acre. And also, the gypsum's not going to be affected by the US dollar because it's made in Kamloops. So it's a nice Canadian product that's readily available. And as we've seen how people are feeling about natural gas coming out of certain nations in the world that may or may not have some conflicts of interest, it's quite nice to know that I'm using a product that burns Canadian natural gas, and I'm not funding a potentially detrimental country in the nation that I don't think people are very fond of right now, or a country in this world that people are very fond of right now.
It also gives you a bit more security if you know it's in your own country, right? It doesn't have to come from somewhere else, and you have to depend on that. And I think, the fact that it's made right here in BC and in Remaire, that's pretty close to home. Now, if we're in the Peace region, we still got to get it up here. Everything seems far for us in the Peace region.
But it's closer than coming out of United States for other types of fertilizer. So that's one benefit.
That's true. Yes. In terms of transportation, have you figured out any ways to make it easier for people to get the product, say, up here in the Peace region?
We're working on a couple different ways to get it up there to help keep the cost down, because as you know, transportation has also gone through the roof and is one of the big costs that's been added on this year. But what we're really doing is we try to have the product ready fairly early in the season, maybe like really early in the spring for guys in the fall. And what we're doing is when they come down with their hay or they're delivering seed down into Vancouver, we try to get it on those trucks as they're going back up instead of setting them up empty. So that's one of the big things we've been working on. One of the others is utilizing farms that have their own equipment and trucks and renting flat deck trailers and using the labor from the farm. And some of those farms have their own fuel already in big tanks, and we're using those guys to deliver loads to other clients instead of just themselves. That's been a fairly big help this spring and this summer so far. We are looking at delivering by rail up into your area in the future. There's a couple of terminals up in the Peace that can handle our product, but they're hoping to get the coated product versus our dustier product because it's just hard to blend. So once we get our nice coated product, hopefully next year, we'll be hopefully shipping it up to the Peace in rail car, and that'll help with the cost significantly.
And good for people to think ahead on how they can make their transportation as effective as possible and never run empty. Now, when you were starting to work with the product, Brett, you mentioned you tried it on your farm, and I'm sure you had lots of other collaborators. Do you have any stories from the Peace region of Peace region collaborators you worked with?
My good buddy Garrett Zahatzi. I don't know if you've ever met the man. He farms by High Prairie, Alberta. He also was broadcasting ammonium sulfate, and he and I went to university together in Saskatchewan. And so he also knew the potential detrimental effects that ammonium sulfate's having on his soil, as he also has a low soil pH and acidic soil pH. So he started working with gypsum as well, broadcasting that as a sulfur source instead of ammonium sulfate. And their reasoning behind that is not necessarily that ammonium sulfate is a different sulfur or a gypsum's a different sulfur. They're both sulfur. They both supply your canola crop with the sulfur you need. It's just the fact that ammonium sulfate has the potential to not necessarily benefit your soil in the fact that it does have a slight acidification effect. The application rate you're making is not significant enough to have a detrimental impact. But over time, there is a chance that 200 pounds an acre of ammonium sulfate every other year is going to start reducing your pH over the course of a decade. So instead, switching to gypsum is why he did that, because the fact that the ammonium sulfate is not going to benefit his soil in the long run, but gypsum is going to benefit his soil. And I can, if you want, I can explain some of the, just in short detail, some of the trials that I did with gypsum, if you're interested.
Yes, I would love to hear some stories. And I know our listeners love to hear applied stories. So please go ahead.
So the customers that I worked with that were at first the most excited about trying gypsum was farmers that have severe sodium issues on some of their land. Like we're talking the type of soils, they turn white in the growing season and nothing grows in those spots. They can seed them in the spring, but usually nothing emerges, or if it does, it's a very poor plant stand. What we did initially is we tried gypsum through the air drill and just putting it right in the seed row at 200 pounds per acre, right with the canola seed. And then we did some untreated checks with nothing seed placed in with the canola seed. And what we found is in those high sodium soil zones, we actually were able to get the canola to germinate and come up out of the ground. Eventually, through the course of the growing season, there's just too much sodium and it does overtake the canola. But that was the first time that a few of these growers had actually been able to get canola to establish in those parts of the field. So they were quite excited about the potential that gypsum has for improving their soil and improving their plant stand. But the downside is very difficult to try to put through your air drill because of the fact that in the current manufacturing process, there is no way to remove the dust off the surface of the prill to create a coating for it that will keep the product intact without having that dusting off. you got to remember they're taking an extremely fine powder and then turning it back into a granule. So anytime that you handle that granule with an auger or there's any type of moisture, that granule wants to become a powder and then become dissolved again. So that is one difficult side of things. But we found that guys were having good success with broadcasting the product through air boom applicators versus trying to apply the products through their air drill. So the first trial that I did on my farm was we went out in a post-harvest situation prior to freeze up, and we had ammonium sulfate and gypsum, and we did strips with an air boom applicator, so a floater, an air boom floater rogator, and did strips of 30 pounds per acre of actual sulfur applied in gypsum and then in ammonium sulfate, and did a few different side-by-side trials. I took it to yield the next year. We had a really good growing season that year. There was good moisture. We had phenomenal canola yields. I think we were in that 60 to 65 bushel an acre range. And there was no significant yield difference between the gypsum and the ammonium sulfate, which was a little bit disappointing to me at the first place because of the fact I was hoping that the calcium was going to make a difference. But at the same time, I was happy to know that by using gypsum, you are not sacrificing any yield potential in comparison to using ammonium sulfate. So that's what we did initially on our farm to make sure that that was going to be a good investment as a sulfur source. And then we've been using it ever since. And the other farmers that I was working with, they were interested in switching out of ammonium sulfate was because they were using ammonium sulfate through their air drill. And some of these farmers unknowingly were actually seed placing this ammonium sulfate with their canola seed. And if there's one way that you want to kill canola seeds, it's put ammonium sulfate in the seed row. It's a very, for lack of a better term, toxic fertilizer in the seed row with a small canola seedling. So they found that they were getting better plant establishment because they were now broadcasting gypsum instead of side banding or seed placing ammonium sulfate with their canola.
You mentioned you didn't notice any direct yield increase that following year, but do you think the calcium that you supplied might show some benefits, say in a more challenging year, or just other health benefits for the plants that maybe didn't come out in the yield per se?
I'm hoping so. I did soil samples and tissue samples in those strips during that trial as well. And that's why I was quite excited. I was really hoping there was a yield difference because there was higher levels of calcium and higher levels in the soil sample and in the tissue sample. Obviously, the soil sample, it's pretty insignificant because I was only putting down 42 pounds an acre of actual calcium. You know, it's a very small amount compared to the 2,500 to 3,500 parts per million of calcium that you have in your soil. I was hoping to see a difference. It did not turn out into a difference. But the one benefit that gypsum has is that it takes moisture and time to dissolve and become plant available. And so when you're applying a product like ammonium sulfate as a post-harvest broadcast application, it's going to be all available at once come spring. All of that sulfur is going to be plant available. However, from what I understand, is that canola does not need a significant amount of sulfur early in the growing season. Canola uses a huge amount of sulfur when it's moving from the vegetative into that reproductive bud formation and bolting stage, moving into flowering. So one benefit that gypsum has in that regard is that the sulfur becomes available over time. So if you have a growing season like we have right now, significant amount of moisture, there is potential for leaching of the sulfur from that ammonium sulfate that you applied. That sulfur from your gypsum is going to still be available to the plant later into the growing season when your canola needs a larger amount of sulfur when it's using more sulfur. So there is that potential benefit in the fact that the sulfur from the gypsum becomes available more coinciding with as the canola needs it. I spoke with a potato agronomist last year, and he did some trials of ammonium sulfate versus gypsum as a sulfur source for the potatoes. And they found that they had maintained good sulfur levels in their PDO testing throughout the growing season with gypsum in comparison to ammonium sulfate. So that sulfur is available longer into the growing season.
I was just going to ask you if you had maybe tried some other crops, like canola seems to be the prime example with the sulfur. What about maybe forage crops? So, for example, alfalfa, also often sulfur being an overlooked component, yet still very important. Any data you've looked into with that?
Unfortunately, I have not been able to convince any of my forage producers to give it a whirl. But one thing that I hope most forage producers try to understand, and they probably do already, but I got two stories that goes good with this, is that every time you harvest your forage crop, you're extracting a huge amount of calcium out of your soil because you're taking the whole plant. That's one thing that just regular grain and oilseed farmers, a lot of that calcium is in the plant material, not necessarily in the seed. So they're not extracting a significant amount of calcium out of their soil. But when you're taking a forage, a lot of calcium is in the plant material that you're removing from that crop. And that's fine. But let's say you turn around and go and do some manure in the concept of putting that back. Well, that doesn't work because the calcium you took out of your soil left in the animal that consumed that. Because I did a research project where we went and took soil samples from customers that we've been working with for about 10 to 15 years and took a look at their calcium levels and their soil pH. And we found that there was a consistent trend in the fact that the soil pH had decreased and the calcium levels had decreased. And the field that I thought for sure would have been holding its own was it was a farmer that had a 4,000 head feedlot, and they'd been layering on the manure quite heavy and then doing corn silage right next to the feedlot. But the same problem was there too. There was no calcium going back into the soil. So even though they were applying manure, there was not a significant amount of calcium going back into the soil as the manure. So for farmers that are harvesting forages, even if they're applying manure, they're still not addressing the calcium concern. That's where I think gypsum has a fantastic fit for a nice slow-release sulfur product that can be available throughout the growing season to your forages, and then also supplying that calcium that does not get applied.
Yeah, oftentimes we get too carried away with our NPKs and forget about our other minerals and nutrients that are needed. So if somebody is intrigued by this and they're thinking, okay, maybe I should give this a try, or even at least, do a test strip or do a test field, how should they go about it? So I guess, first of all, they would have to start with a soil test, right?
Yeah, that's a fantastic way to get started, is to see what your calcium levels are like and what your pH is like, to see if you think that gypsum is going to have a good fit for your soils. And especially if you have high sodium issues, that's where gypsum has a great fit.
You mentioned you're working on improving your product to have less of that dustiness. Do you want to, maybe there's some other things in the pipeline you want to kind of tease folks with that are coming on board soon?
Well, that's one of them there. We're also kind of listening to some of the piece farmers that are clients and trying to find out what else they're looking for. Obviously, blending gypsum with other products, as you mentioned, the MPK stuff. So finding locally sourced products to blend in is something we're talking about. We're hoping we can get there, but lots of demand for the gypsum product right now. So we haven't quite got to that point. So first step is to coat it so that there is the option for the seed row and the seed cart, hopefully next year. And then we'll move on from there.
Excellent. So people should just stay tuned. In the meantime, if they do have questions or if they would like to know more or get a site-specific recommendation for themselves, who could they reach out to?
If they want to know about how to access the product and how much it costs and how to get it on farm, they should talk to Mr. Wilson. If they have soil samples and fertility questions or any farmer-based point of views, because I can definitely give that point of view as well as to why I've found gypsum is so much of a benefit for us in the logistics side of things. Because we used to apply ammonium sulfate in a blend through our air drill on all of our canola fertilizer acres. And if there's anybody out there who has worked in fertilizer retail or on farm that has had issues with ammonium sulfate, it only has to happen once. And then you will strive to the ends of the earth to never have to deal with ammonium sulfate again, because it is a painful product to try to put through your air drill if it takes on a bunch of moisture and causes you a bunch of issues. So that was another really easy logistical decision, that we never had to put ammonium sulfate through our air drill again. It was kind of the icing on the cake as to why gypsum was a good fit for our farm.
And it sounds like you have a lot of excellent applied stories, which always makes it just so much more tangible for a producer, especially if you're trying something new, right? It's always a risk, and folks like to have a bit of assurance and ideas how it might work. So thank you so much for sharing all that. And I will leave a link to your webpage as well in the show notes. Is there anything else that you would like to share about gypsum or DBD in general that I forgot to ask you about?
No, I think that was great, Nadia. I think that was a great way to teach people about the product. Like if they want to hear about the product more on my side and not hear Brett ramble on about his farming stories, they can give me a call anytime. Are you able to leave my phone number in the link as well?
I can leave your contact information if you're comfortable with that. Yeah,
I'm comfortable with that, so they can call me anytime. We're working hard right now to try and fulfill orders for the fall, and then also into next spring right now. So if anybody's interested, they can give me a call anytime.
The only problem is that Mark Wilson can't produce enough. They need to make more of it, because there's just so many farmers that want to use this product. But unfortunately, the facility has limited capacity as to how much it can produce. For now, right, Mark? One day you'll be making more and more gypsum so that more and more farmers can use it.
He's not lying. It's interesting. We since we started the granulation machine, we haven't been able to really keep up, and thinking of growing the machine or making it bigger has always been in discussions. But I think getting it out there first, getting enough people aware of it, being able to apply it in the seed cart, spinner spread, boom float, all those options for farmers as everybody does something different is kind of the first big step for us. And then we'll see what happens from there.
Well, I do appreciate you taking the time today to share the scoop of gypsum with me.
You bet. Thank you very much, Nadia. I appreciate the opportunity to do that, my first podcast.
Welcome back. As Mark Wilson indicated, he is more than happy to talk to folks interested in gypsum and the potential benefits to their soils. You can reach him at 250-819-6263 or visit dbdinc.ca for more information. Next up, how would you like to cut your canola seed cost in half and still get a bumper crop? If that sounds like music to your ears, then check out the next episode where I talk to Evan Keane on his project of doing just that. If you found value in this or other episodes of our Knowledge for Resilience podcast series, please share with your friends, families, and colleagues all across the globe. You can find us on various podcast platforms, including Podbean, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcast, and of course, the 4 Partner Association websites. Wherever you tune in from, make sure you like, subscribe, hit the bell, or follow us so you never miss another episode. Funding for this project was provided by the BC Hydro Peace Agricultural Compensation Fund. Thank you so much for making this project possible and supporting local agriculture in the Peace and beyond. For feedback or suggestions on other great Peace Region-related agricultural topics, email us at coordinator@peaceforage.bc.ca. Until next time, stay informed, stay resilient.